Hello, everyone. I am Claudiu Murgan, the host of the Spiritual Inspire Show, and my guest today is Wade Davis. He's an ethnographer, writer, photographer, and filmmaker. He holds several degrees, in fact, in anthropology and biology, and received his PhD in ethnobotany from Harvard University. Mostly through Harvard Botanical Museum, he spent over 3 years in the Amazon and Andes as a plant explorer, living among 15 indigenous groups in 8 Latin American nations, while making some 6,000 botanical collections. His work later took him to Haiti to investigate folk preparations implicated in the creation of zombies, an assignment that led to his writing Passage of Darkness in 1988 and The Serpent and the Rainbow in 1986, an international bestseller later released by Universal as a motion picture. Wade Davis is an explorer in residence at the National Geographic Society, which named him as one of the explorers of the Millennium, describing him at the same time as a rare combination of scientist, scholar, poet, and passionate defender of all of life's diversity. In recent years, his work has taken him to East Africa, Borneo, Nepal, Peru, Polynesia, Tibet, Mali, Colombia, Vanuatu, Mongolia, and the high Arctic of Nunuvut and Greenland. Davis is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Explorer's Medal, the highest award of the Explorers Club in 2011, the Gold Medal of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society in 2009, the 2002 Lowell Thomas Medal, the Explorers Club, and the 2002 Lannan Foundation 125,000 prize for literary nonfiction. Wade, thank you very much for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thanks for that wonderful introduction.
I mean, your list of achievements is so long that I had a hard time being selective. You know, it's hard. And my conclusion after reading so much about you and watching several of your movies is that you always had a thirst for living your life fully, you know, chasing the next adventure, learning new traditions, trying to quench this insatiable desire to know and experience. Pretty much you're an Indiana Jones that is not looking for physical artifacts, but for spiritual ones. Is that true?
Well, in a way, I think, I certainly grew up sort of with Baudelaire's disease, horror of home. And I think like many of my generation who came of age in a difficult time, the 1960s, we were drawn to the allure of the unknown and in a way seeking a more authentic experience. I think, I always remember what Jim Whittaker said, the first American to summit Everest. He said, if you're not living on the edge when you're young, you're taking up too much space. And another friend of mine, Terence McKenna, wonderfully said that, the great lesson of life is that you jump off the cliff and you land not on rock, but on a featherbed. The world exists to lift you up, not to beat you down. And certainly coming from a very kind of bourgeois upbringing in Canada, I had a very strong hunger and a strong curiosity to travel, to experience the exoticism of the unknown. And I also grew up in Quebec, although my family was from British Columbia. I grew up in Quebec at a time of the two solitudes where French and English weren't speaking to each other. And my neighborhood was an English suburb, kind of plunked onto the back of a old Francophone village that went back to the 18th century, if not the 17th century. And there was literally a boulevard, Cartier Boulevard, that divided the French from the English. And my mother would send me to a little store on that corner that was owned by a lovely old Francophone couple to buy her milk or cigarettes or whatever she needed. And I remember even as a young boy of 5 and 6, sitting on their porch and looking across that road and thinking, wow, across this road is another language, another religion, another way of being. And I desperately wanted to cross that road, and I did, ignoring all the voices of bigotry or concern, not in my family, but in my society. And in a certain sense, Claudio, I've been I've been crossing that road ever since as an anthropologist. And at the age of 14, my mother, who was a humble but determined Canadian woman, told me that Spanish was the language of the future. And she worked very hard all year as a secretary to save enough money to allow me to join a small group of schoolboys that a teacher was taking to Cali, Colombia in the summer of 1968. And it's hard for us to remember now, but at that time, most Canadians and indeed Americans, indeed most Europeans, had never been in a commercial airline. And the South American destination was very exotic. And, 10 weeks is a long time in the life of a 14-year-old boy. And I was the youngest of the group at 14. The other lads were 16. I think one was even 17. And I was also the most fortunate because whereas the other boys were billeted with very affluent families and they spent a summer in the sweltering streets of Cali, I was fortunate to be with a more modest family who had a home in the mountains above the city on the edge of paths that reached west to the Pacific. And so for the 10 weeks, I never saw the other Canadian lads. And many of them, it turned out, succumbed to what the Colombians call mamitis, or homesickness. And the irony is that though I was the youngest, I felt not only not homesick, I felt like I had finally found home. And I think that gave me that both love of Colombia, and I'm now an honorary Colombian citizen, but also a tremendous sense of the freedom of the open road. The way that the road can allow you to reinvent yourself. The nature of travel being, of course, to never come back the same. It's often said that the tourist can't remember where they've been and the traveler doesn't know where they're going. And the whole point of the open road is to reach what the Irish call the thin places, where heaven and earth come together to reveal glimpses of the divine. And I think, again, that is something that propelled me from the youngest age. I mean, it's curious. My parents, both of whom were very much, I think, psychologically impacted by the Second World War for different reasons, were not religious people. And I hardly ever saw the inside of a church in the companionship of my father, for example. But that said, at a very early age of 5 and 6, I began to go to church on my own. I picked my own church and I went to it religiously every Sunday on my own at the age of 5 and 6. I had something of a spiritual hunger, I think, even at that young age.
Interesting. I mean, it's beautiful to kind of find a way from such a young age and feel the desire, the attraction to nature and to a country which you never explored or never heard of. And now at this age, are you more relaxed or are you still on the edge looking for the next adventure?
Well, I've never, I think one thing that's really important for young people listening to a podcast like this is that there's a tendency to look up at people who have accomplished things, even people you may admire, and you sort of think, well, how can I ever become like that? Well, the answer is just wait. I'm 67. Of course, I've accomplished more things than someone 21. How could that not be the case? But that doesn't mean that they won't accomplish just as much. I mean, there's nothing worse than the old man who sort of looks back at their life and denies those following in his wake the chance to have their own adventures. After all, what is life but a story? We lose the power of comprehending as we get old, and every generation makes its own mythologies and achieves its own greatness. And young people simply have to be patient and give their destiny time to find them. I never knew what I wanted to do, but I was, in retrospect, kind of viscerally incapable of compromise. And I also eventually learned a very important lesson that eluded me in my early years. I used to think, like so many do in bourgeois society, that creativity is an objective force that happens to other people, but not to you. And of course, creativity is never the motivation of action. It's a consequence of action. You can't be creative if you don't do. So if you want to be a creative person, just get out there and start doing things, you know, and I certainly followed that. And I think that although I didn't know where I wanted to go, I was incapable of compromising, and I always looked forward. I never once looked back over my shoulder. And unfortunately, that's the only direction that most people ever experience. And so I very much live by the adage that, do what needs to be done and only then ask whether it was possible or permissible. I think without thinking about it, I understood that despair was a insult to the imagination, that pessimism was an indulgence, that orthodoxy was the enemy of invention. I was comfortable being an opportunist. If I wasn't going to learn at home, I put myself in the way of people from whom I could learn. And I quickly understood that nothing was a waste of time. Nothing was beneath you unless you made it so. I mean, a taxi cab driver could have as much wisdom and as much to teach you as a professor at a university. A job in a logging camp could be as informative and useful to your life as a year in a research lab at a top Ivy School university, Ivy League university. I never thought that anything was beneath me, and by putting myself in the way of opportunities where there was no choice but success, you find yourself being capable of achieving things that would have been beyond your imaginings a few short weeks or even months before. So I think that's sort of how I've lived my life. And it all comes down really to a single word: when in doubt, move. When asked, say yes. And have one word in your vocabulary for new experience, and that is yes. The other thing, I think, Claudiu, that I think is an important lesson. The greatest challenge in life is to become the architect of your own life. Invariably, and you do that by cultivating a kind of inner compass whereby you own all of your decisions. Now, all of your decisions may not be the right ones, but you at least have responsibility for them. So you look back over a long series of decisions and you recognize that you at least controlled your destiny, which is, of course, the quest in life. And inevitably, in older age, bitterness comes to those who look back on a life of decisions imposed upon them from the outside. And invariably, the people I meet at my age who are content are those who found their own inner compass and followed it throughout their lives, recognizing that a vocation or a job, a vocation is just something, it's a lens through which you experience in the world for a time. And the goal in life is not to achieve greatness in a vocation, but to make life itself your vocation, the art of being alive, your greatest creative endeavor. And one other, I think, thing I learned very early on, and this I did learn from my family, my father in particular, who, as I said, was not a religious man, but he was a very wise man, a very good man, a very ethical man. And he used to say to me, there's good and evil in the world, son, take your pick and get on with it. And what he really meant is that we have this idea in Christianity in particular, there's good, which we embody in the Christ child, and evil in the fallen archangel, who is the devil, and we put them in mortal combat. And we always have this idea that eventually, if we just wait long enough, good will vanquish evil, but it never seems to happen. And if you look in the Vedic scriptures, by contrast, when Lord Krishna was asked the obvious question, the question for which you would be burned as a heretic in France in the 15th century, the obvious question we all ponder is, if God's all powerful, why does God allow evil to exist in the universe? And again, as I say, if you ask that question in the medieval Catholic context, you would be accused of and punished for heresy. But when Lord Krishna was asked that very question by a disciple, if God's all powerful, why does he allow evil to exist in the universe? Lord Krishna said, to thicken the plot. In other words, he had this, good and evil are not going to go away, and that's the lesson of the Buddha. The first of the noble truths: all life is suffering. By that, the Buddha didn't mean that all life was misery. He meant that negative things happen in the world as a consequence of karma. And the second noble truth, the cause of suffering, is ignorance. By that, the Buddha didn't mean stupidity. He meant the tendency of human beings to cling to the cruel illusion of our own centrality in the stream of divine existence. The third of the noble truths was the revelation that ignorance could be overcome. And the fourth, of course, and the most practical, was the delineation of a contemplative practice, the eightfold path that, if followed, not only had a possibility of the transformation of the human heart, but had 2,500 years of empirical observation to suggest that transformation would be assured. It would be a certainty. And when you adopt that perspective, you realize that, again, the metaphor of the pilgrim's journey is not toward a destination; it's toward a state of mind. And the path of the pilgrim is toward the revelation of the Buddha, the unveiling of one's own true Buddha nature. And when you take that as a kind of an idea, then you don't expect good to beat evil. And when you do face disappointment, a death, or an environmental battle lost, or a war not prevented, you don't indulge despair. You just get on with the next struggle, if you know what I mean, because the goal is not to get to a place of good triumphing over evil. It's to get to a place where your shoulders to the wheel of justice and decency, honor and good, no matter what else is going on in the world. And so that allows you in your 80th year, at least in my experience, although I'm not, fortunately, not quite 80 yet, but it allows you to keep going, because there is no destination. There is no endpoint. It is a process of being alive in this short period of time. You know, a shaman once said to me something very profound. You know, he said, you know, in the first years of your life, you don't quite understand the world all around you or what you're supposed to do. And in the last years of your life, you don't understand the world coming at you from below or coming at you from the future, if you will. And in between, he said, there's a narrow window of light that illuminates your life. And that's where you have to decide whether or not you will be able to see.
Wow, yeah, so much wisdom, and you pack so much information there that you mentioned about the bitterness of those who look back at what they accomplished in life, and there's not too much there, and that's sometimes a middle life crisis, and then that continues into their 60s and 70s because they cannot find their path. They think that everything is lost, and they are not willing to, you know, change or make changes and adjust their life. They still hang on a job, or, as you said, a vocation, instead of living their life. And
well, you know, it's interesting, the word job. Every kid comes out of, you know, college or high school keen to find a job. And I always say, be careful, because the word job in English comes from the medieval French word gobert, meaning to devour. And my father had a job all of his life. He called it the grind. And as a little boy, I used to think he went into town every day and came home a little smaller. And he did, in fact, and eventually it killed him. I think the goal is to never have a job, but to work harder than anyone you ever know. And the word work in English has a more attractive, charismatic origin in sort of the term for create or inspire. And so we should all work very hard, but avoid jobs at all cost. And then I think you're well on your way. And you know, the main thing is to realize that you know, people all around you are invested in how you are. But if you want to grow and change, you have to realize that every time you make a step forward, there will be someone who will try to hold you back. You know, you know, one of the things that happens to me all the time is that people get, you know, people who follow the rules all their lives get very frustrated with someone like myself, who has never seen a rule he didn't reflexively have to break. Not in a gratuitous way, but you know, I've just never seen a rule that made much sense to me. You know, I'm not talking about ethical or moral values. I'm talking about just rules, and yet, having ignored rules all my life, I've been very generously rewarded by life. And it's very difficult for those who have followed every rule all of their lives and only found that that path leads often to nowhere, that gets so frustrated by the mistakes that they've made. And part of that mistake is having faith in rules. Now, I started off, it was a proverbial thing, why do you have to go to Harvard? Why isn't the local university good enough? Wait a minute, you're at Harvard studying law. What's this anthropology thing? Wait a minute, you've studied anthropology. What's this botany thing? Wait a minute, you just came back from the Amazon for 3 years and you're this, precocious botanist, and you're going to do what? Study voodoo? Wait a minute, you've just studied voodoo for 2 years. You've written 2 books, the best-selling books in the history of voodoo, and you're doing what? You're turning your back on that, and you're going where? Borneo, to be an activist in the rainforest with what tribe? The Penan? We've never heard about them. Wait a minute, you almost, with the help of the Grateful Dead, saved the Penan in their forest. You've written 2 books and made all these films, an international campaign, and you're going to do what? You're going to write a biography of someone we've never heard of. Now, wait a minute, you just wrote a biography of Richard Evans Schultes that won the governor, came close to winning the Governor General's Award and was widely heralded. And you're going to do what? You're going to study language loss? What's that? My point is not to be boastful of a litany of experiences, but my point is that every single step of the way, how can you be a photographer? How many times do you hear young people say, I want to be a photographer. Where's the program I can sign up that will make me a photographer? Or you can't be a photographer because your label says anthropologist. Wait a minute, you can't be a filmmaker. You're supposed to be a writer. Wait a minute, you're a filmmaker and a writer. So what is all this about? Starting a podcast. Wait a minute, you're supposed to be, you just got a Harvard degree. What do you mean you're going to go and work at the lowest level of a logging camp? Wait a minute, you've actually become a logging engineer. You've got a big career ahead. How can you just throw it all away to go back? You know what I'm saying? And I think a lot of pressure comes on young people, no matter what the arrows of opportunity are that are cast their way. And I remember, for example, an amusing story that when I was 23, and even though on paper I had a good record, I had graduated from Harvard, I had spent 2 years in the Amazon, I was considered a up and coming young botanical explorer and so on and so forth. But I was so uncertain that I ended up, working in a logging camp for a year, which turned out to be the best thing that I ever was able to do, because in the 1980s, when we had the great fight for the forests in British Columbia, I was one of the few environmentalists who could speak with the loggers. I had been a logger. I had tremendous empathy and sympathy for men and women who fought off hunger with a chainsaw. I was never their enemy. And so together we could seek solutions. And during all those nothing was sort of a waste of time, and things unfolded that way.
Yeah.
Oh, and then I was just going to say, in a moment of incredible uncertainty, however, at the age of 23, when my friends were sort of falling away to medical school or law school or whatever, I actually applied to graduate school in botany and to law school at the same time, as if they were the same thing. It's ridiculous. And I got into both law school and into graduate school. And I remember, mercifully, my sister was articling at a law firm, a posh law firm in Vancouver. And I went to pick her up. And this wonderful little old lady behind the desk, who really was my fairy godmother, I just didn't know it yet. She looked up at me and she said, "Are you Karen's brother, Wade?" And I said, "Yes." "And you've just come back from the Amazon," she said. And I replied, "Yes." "And you eat all these weird plants?" And I had to confess, yes. And then she said, "You follow me." It's a true story, Claudiu. And she walked me back through this posh law firm into the library with all these sort of books to the ceiling. And she had set up a ladder that rose to a lithograph of an English solicitor from the 18th century, you know, the Whigs. And she said to me, "You climb that ladder." And I dutifully climbed the ladder until I was face to face with this lithograph. And here was this man, fat belly, hooked nose, big wig, ugly, gout, you name it. And she suddenly yelled from the bottom of the ladder and she said, "Is that you?" And I looked at this lithograph and I screamed, "No." And I came down the ladder, went to her front desk, called the law school, retracted my successful application, and went off to Harvard to study zombies with Schultes.
Wow, wonderful. I mean, this summary you just did is unbelievable. We can end the interview here, but I won't do it. We still have a lot to cover. So in the movie El Sendero de la Anaconda, you mentioned that the Amazon is God's laboratory. Is that because of the extensive biological and cultural diversity?
You know, that was just a beautiful phrase, really. You know, from here he went out to build the world, and that is sort of the feeling you have, particularly in the northwest Amazon of Colombia, where you have these extraordinary geological formations that predate the rise of the Andes. And of course, these are these ancient massifs that go all the way to the Tapuis of the Guyanas and of Venezuela. And of course, these great cataracts like Hiririmo and Ayacopi and others in the Northwest Amazon. You know, the real kind of good fortune that I had as a student was to fall into the orbit of two different mentors. One we've mentioned, Richard Evans Schultes, the legendary botanical explorer who sparked the psychedelic era with his discovery of the magic mushrooms in Mexico in 1938. But then later in 1941, he went away to Colombia and he sort of slipped into the rainforest, where he remained for 12 uninterrupted years, traveling down unknown rivers, living amongst unknown peoples, all the time enchanted by the wonder of the tropical rainforest. And his experience was extraordinary because he was the first outsider that many of those communities, those cultures had ever encountered, who wasn't there to rape their daughters or to exploit their labor or to transform their spiritual lives. He was simply a solitary student of plants who sat at the feet of the shaman as a student to a master. And he became so well known that in the 1970s, when a friend of mine, Andrew Weil, was going down to Colombia to investigate yahe or ayahuasca, he met one of Schultes' old colleagues at the Instituto at the Nacional in Bogota. And Professor Idrobo, who was a good friend of mine, I know his son, he was just a wonderful scholar. And so many fantastic Colombian scholars at that time, botanists, you know, there still are, of course. Colombia is a great center for scientific research, particularly in the natural sciences. But anyway, you know, Jesus Idrobo said to Andy, if you ever get in trouble in that country, and he was referring to an area of the Amazon the size of France, just mention Schultes' name, porque en esa tierra Schultes es Dios. In that land, Schultes is God. And so Schultes was a real explorer who inspired by the example of his deeds. But I also had as a tutor in anthropology, the legendary South Americanist David Mabray Lewis, who was also an activist who founded Cultural Survival. And David inspired, if not by his deeds, which were legendary in and of themselves, but by the example of his character, his deep compassion, his incredible searing intellect, the eloquence with which he spoke. And these two men, you know, by their examples, taught me that cultural diversity and biological diversity, in some sense, were two sides of the same coin. And that's something we take for granted today, but in the 1970s, it wasn't. And at that time, I remember, for example, when E.O. Wilson, a legendary biologist, was introducing a scholar who had written one of the first books on the biodiversity crisis. And right that same night, the Dalai Lama was making his final speech on his first tour of America. And naturally, all the faculty and students were across the way to listen to His Holiness, the 14th Dalai Lama. And in apologizing to the guest for the sparse audience in the adjacent hall, Ed Wilson, probably the greatest biologist of the 20th century, as kind and decent a man who's ever lived, as fine a scientist who's ever existed, a man who would regret these words to his grave, nevertheless said, even if Harvard students can't get their priorities right and they'd rather be across the way listening to that religious kook, you know how far we've got to go to educate the public at large. But at that time, there was that chasm whereby the biologists looked at people as a problem, indigenous people in particular. The anthropologists couldn't abide the misanthropic elitism of the naturalists. And that night I was the only student probably running back and forth between the two talks, but that was because of these influences. And so I came out of university very much with an activist mode. And, anthropology was born in North America in the vision of Franz Boas. And that vision was one of activism. Ruth Benedict, one of his great students, said the entire purpose of anthropology is to make the world safe for human differences. And so I've always felt that, as we now know, of course, that the same forces affecting biological diversity are eroding cultural diversity. And we have this idea that these cultures, delicate and fragile and quaint and colorful, are somehow destined to fade away, as if by natural law, as if their failed attempts at being modern, failed attempts at keeping up. Nothing could be further from the truth. In every case, these are living, dynamic peoples being driven out of existence by identifiable forces. And those forces can be ideological, they can be industrial, they can be military. But the very recognition that these cultures aren't drifting away, but being driven from history, is an optimistic one, because it suggests if human beings are the agents of cultural destruction, we can be the facilitators of cultural survival. Now, right behind you, I'm looking at La Ciudad Perdida, right?
Yes.
The ancient center of the Tairona. Now, those who don't know wouldn't perhaps recognize that that ancient site right behind Claudiu is right above the beaches where Columbus' men landed on the third journey in 1493, I think it was, or 1495. And those mountains are 2 hours by plane from Miami Beach, and yet they remain the domain of the elder brothers. Four societies, Kankwano, Arawako, Wiwa, and Kogi, all Chibchan language speaking, mutually unintelligible languages. They communicate in Spanish, but all descendants of the ancient Tairona. And to this day, in a bloodstained continent, they are ruled by a ritual priesthood of mamos. And the training for the priesthood is austere in the extreme. The acolytes are taken away from their families at the age of 3 and 4, sequestered in a shadowy world of darkness for 18 years, 2 9-year periods deliberately chosen to mimic the 9 months of gestation in their natural mother's womb. Now, metaphorically, they're in the womb of the great mother, the Madre Creadora. And during all this time, they are taught the Baroque beliefs of their lineage, which include the idea that their prayers and rituals literally maintain the cosmic balance of the world. And for all of those years, the acolyte never really sees a sunrise. He never sees the mountains. He never really knows the beauty of the world. It all just exists as an abstraction as he's enculturated into this incredibly intense religious world view. And then suddenly, after the training is complete, he is taken out of the environs of the sacred temple and led on a journey to the heart of the world, from the temple to the ice, from the ice to the sea, from the sea back to the temple. And the priest who has trained him basically says during that journey, that pilgrimage, it's as I've promised you all these years. The earth is that beautiful. It's yours to protect. Now, the idea that that visionary realm still exists to inform us is profoundly significant, but also profoundly hopeful. And when the Mamos speak, they speak as if Columbus was a recent arrival. In 500 years, they transformed themselves from a warlike civilization to a devotional culture of peace. And I'm not speaking hippie ethnography. I'm talking about this is actually how they live. They believe that the blood that runs through your body is no different than the water that runs down the current of the Rio Magdalena. And in that sense, they're quite accurate, because when we die, we all, like a river, become part of the hydrological cycle. Fluid in our body flows into the sea, it evaporates into the clouds, clouds form in the mountains, and rain precipitates back onto the land. This is a cycle of life, if you will. And so the question is, what do those voices mean to us in the modern world? Well, that begs the question is, what is the modern world? And we have this idea, that because of the dominance of the Western paradigm, its ubiquity, that somehow it's the norm. And because of our power and the fact that, like all cultures, we're myopic and we think our way of life is the way of life, we kind of dismiss these other peoples of the world. But in fact, our way of life is the anomaly. In our particular tradition in Europe, where we try to liberate ourselves from the tyranny of absolute faith, when Descartes deanimated the world by saying that all that exists is mind and material, as science made a house cleaning of belief, as we swept away all notions of myth, magic, mysticism, and metaphor, suddenly the flight of a bird could not have meaning. The world was just a stage upon which only the human drama unfolded. A mountain was not a sacred being. A mountain was a pile of rock. A forest wasn't the domain of spirits. A forest was cellulose and board feet. They existed to be cut. Now, the fascinating thing is we take that to be the norm because it's our way of thinking. But viewed through the ethnographic lens, that way of thinking is in fact highly anomalous. Most cultures view life and the natural world through the lens of reciprocity. The simple idea that the earth owes its bounty to people, but people in turn owe their fidelity to the earth. Now, that basic equation is elaborated in many different ways in different cultures through ceremony and ritual, but that basic sense of exchange defines a kind of dialectic, if you will. And it has real consequences, because if you believe that a mountain is a pile of rock, you don't hesitate to tear it apart. If you believe it's an Apu deity, as do the people of the high Andes in Peru, you may hesitate to do so. If you believe that a forest exists to be cut, you cut it. But if you believe that it's a domain of Hukuk and the crooked beak of heaven and the cannibal spirits to be met during the Hametz initiation, as a Kwakwaka'wakw in the salmon forest of British Columbia believe, you don't cut it. So these beliefs have real consequences in terms of the ecological footprint of the people. And it's important to remember that when we speak of something like climate change, which has become humanity's problem, it was not caused by humanity. It was caused by a narrow subset of humanity that for the last 300 years has been consuming the ancient sunlight of the world. Most cultures in the world played no role whatsoever in the generation of this dilemma. And they're the ones who are suffering the consequences of the dilemma, whether it's the Inuit in the high Arctic, whose world is literally melting from beneath them, or whether it's the island inhabitants of Polynesia, whose oceans are literally inundating their homelands, or wherever you go. And so one of the reasons the voices of these people matter is they exist to still inform us of other possibilities. And they put the lie to those of us in our own culture who say that we cannot change, as we all know we must, the fundamental way in which we inhabit this planet.
Yeah, I mean, I know you spent time with the Arhuaco tribe, which is the descendants of Tairona. Did you have the chance to spend any time with the Koji tribe?
Oh yeah, I mean, I had a funny story when I was hanging out at an Arhuaco village on the Don Diego River, al lado de la playa, and a friend of mine, Mamo Camillo, I had asked him, if it was true that the Mamos did ritual payments, pagamientos, at the mouth of the Magdalena, which is well beyond the traditional black line that circumscribes the homeland of the people, the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, the mountain chain that rises to 20,000 feet out of the Caribbean coastal plain. And it turns out they did do ritual payments. And I said, well, let's go do one. And then I learned, of course, that the Mamos traditionally would walk in pilgrimage all the way to the source of the Magdalena, 1,500 kilometers away in the Macizo Colombiano. But en route, Mamo Camillo said something very interesting to me. He said, la paz no vale nada si es solamente una manera en que los varios lados del conflicto pueden unificarse para mantener una guerra contra la naturaleza. Lo que tenemos que hacer paz con todo el mundo. And what he had said, of course, was that, peace won't matter if it's just an excuse for the various sides of the conflict to come together to maintain a war against nature. We have to make, and then he said that President Santos, Colombia's Nobel laureate for the peace process that culminated in 2016, was going to be visiting their community at Namasimake in 4 days. Could I be there to help welcome him? Well, I knew that the only way I could get there logistically would be to hitch a ride with the president on his helicopter. So I made some phone calls to some friends, and before I knew it, I got a call back from the Palacio Nariño saying that President Santos would welcome to have Profi Davis. He always called me Profi Davis, come along. So I flew from Barranquilla to Bogota, and a soldier took me over to the presidential plane. We flew back up to Valledupar, where the helicopters were waiting. We went into Namasimake. And en route, all of the president's aides was sort of pounding him with datos, statistics about what he should say for his speech. And I kind of sheepishly put up my hand. I didn't know him that well at that point. We had met. But it was before he made me an honorary citizen so kindly. But I repeated what Mamo Camillo had said, and the president made that the theme of his speech that tweeted out to the world and was broadcast within Colombia. But after that, we were in the men's circle where the formal exchanges occurred, and the president introduced his party, all his ministers and so on. And he got around to me, and he was very generous in his praise. He was very kind, but he was interrupted in his remarks by one of the Mamos, who said, Presidente, no, you don't have to introduce that guy. He's our ambassador in Washington, D.C. And it's true that the Mamos of both the Kogi, the Wiwa, and the Arhuacos would always stay with us in Washington. And I remember there was a wonderful Kogi Mamo, Mamo Jacinto, who was a very tiny little guy, but very, very spiritually awake and very much alive. And we used to have in our house in Washington these two big ostrich eggs over the fireplace. And Mamo Jacinto would say, for the Mamos, nothing is insignificant. Everything is warm with the spirit of Aluna, the essential essence. And so Mamo Jacinto would say to me, like, oye, hermano, ¿qué es eso? And I'd say, Mami, Jacinto, son huevos. And he'd say, no son huevos. Like, no, hombre, son huevos. Interesante. No. And he said, those can't be eggs. I mean, the eggs were as big as his body, No, so, it's funny. There's a kind of a myth or that I think, bless him, Reichel Domatov, who I admire enormously. But I think Reichel was responsible in part for perpetuating this idea that the Kogi were the real spiritual ones in the Sierra. And this has always irritated the Arhuacos, and who is a silly kind of one-upmanship. But certainly the Arhuacos are as deeply engaged, and their ideas are every bit as profound. I think the Kogi, because of their geographical location and because of tradition, have always been a little bit more less likely to engage the outside world. But that's kind of a continuum. The other end of that are the Cancuano, who were living on the side of the mountains above the Rio Cesar, looking down to Valledupar, and that was settled very early because it's good land and the river was there. And the Cancuano sort of made a Faustian pact with the devil moving towards more assimilation. And so today the Kankwano, as you know, are struggling to sort of revitalize their culture. More power to them. Whereas in a rather remarkable way, both the Wiwa and the Kogi and the Arawakos have maintained their fidelity to the Great Mother.
Yeah, I mean, I had another guest on this show who was in contact with Koji for almost 9 years. They were telling her to bring certain people to them for messages, for enlightenment, for whatever the purpose was, and she was the go between the
you have to be, let me be. I know her, and you have to be a little careful. Look, the Kogi and the Arawakos are unbelievably clever. And they know the power of their image, and they one of the keys to their cultural survival has been their ability to manipulate all of us, right? I mean, eventually, as my friend Graham Townsley said, who was a BBC producer and anthropologist who set up the circumstances for Alan Herrera to do his wonderful film From the Heart of the World that you probably know well. As Graham said, eventually both the Arawakos, but especially the Kogi, kick out everybody. And Reichel was eventually kicked out, in the 1940s. Alan Herrera, we're all aware of that. I don't mean that in a cynical way. I mean, they're very clever at manipulating their image. I mean, even the traje that they wear. They wear it because it's traditional clothing and they're traditional people, but they're acutely aware of the public image and the power of that image. And if I had a dime for every gringo who's gone into those mountains and has come out saying that I am the special messenger for the Kogi, I'd be a very rich person. I think it's sort of silly to take on that role or pretend that you've been uniquely blessed. It's sort of a disservice to the Arawako because they have multiple keys to their cultural survival, but one of them is their ability to both attract and collaborate with, but also exploit, in the best sense of the word, outsiders. Yeah. And it's worked for them for a long time.
Yes. A quote from the movies about the Arahoko quite impressed me. The younger brother doesn't know how to cancel the debt with nature. I mean, I think it's so profound and we don't understand that in the Western world.
Well, I think this is where not just the Arawakos and the Kogi and the Wiwa and the Kankwano, but many indigenous people, again, this idea of metaphor. I mean, if you go to the Northwest Amazon of Colombia, for example, into the homeland of the Barasana and the Macuna, the Tanimucos, their most profound cultural intuition is the idea that plants and animals are just people in another dimension of reality. Their creator myths all speak of a great journey of the ancestors in the sacred canoes or in the belly of the sacred serpent or drawn by the anaconda. And in their rituals, they can actually recite toponyms, as many as 1,600 toponyms of places down the Milk River of the Amazon that they have never visited in their lives, but they remember in a mythological sense places that exist. But there's always an element of the arrival of the Iowas, the thunders, right, who come up the river and find the world in chaos, that the primordial female progenitor of the world, Romikumu, has actually turned the world upside down to let it be reborn. And as they come up the river, they're pushing the trumpets, which become the Yuri Pari trumpets of male initiation. And the idea is that the four thunders who have they make love with Romikumu and they fertilize the world, but also they restore through their power the harmonic balance of the world. And again, this metaphor of balance and reciprocity, so that, amongst the Barasana, you can't just go to the forest and shoot an animal. You have to go to the shaman. The shaman's got to go to the animal masters. The animal masters have to give permission to the, and so on. And when we actually get into that deeper, you realize that all of these ideas, all their cosmology, all their mythology, when come together, amount effectively to being a land management plan that dictates how people can live in the forest. And we see this in cultures around the world, in the high Arctic. If a child kills a seal, if it does not drip fresh water into the mouth of the seal, he will never kill another animal. Or if the deserts of Australia, when an Aboriginal person kills a kangaroo, there's an unbelievably precise protocol in both the distribution of the meat, but also the way the carcass is treated. And again, you get this is the essence of the hunter. And one of the thing that the anti-hunting people don't understand is that hunting is the origin of religion, because death is the first mystery. It's a moment beyond which life as we know it ends and wonder begins. I mean, if you want to understand the essential religious belief system of any people, you just have to ask, what do they think about death? Every religion is trying to deal with that inexorable mystery, that inevitable destination that we all will. I mean, it's a fascinating thing, death, if you think about it. We all know we're going to experience it. We all know that all people through all time have experienced it, that all of our descendants will experience it. And yet, no matter how many, probes we can put on the surface of Mars and how many incredible discoveries we can make in the very nature of life in terms of our understanding of DNA, we will never, by definition, ever, 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 ever know what happens in death. And that's why, of course, why it's so ironic that religion and science are sometimes seen to be opposed to each other, because they're never in opposition, because science only answers the question how, and only religion can answer the question why. And so death is the first teacher. And so in these hunting societies, myths emerge as a kind of covenant, as Joseph Campbell said, between predator and prey, and a way of rationalizing the terrible fact that to live, you had to kill the animals upon which you depended. And so these sort of relationships with the natural world grew out of that. And in shamanic traditions, the purpose of the shaman is to release the individual's wild genius, whereas the priest is a completely different character, because the priest, his job or her job is to socialize the individuals into a collective, a congregation where they can be subjected to a common ideology, often for the purpose of control. And in between all of that is a shaman, the curandero of the Northwest Amazon, in a people like the Barasan or the Macuna, where the curandero or the maestro or the brujo or the shaman is neither priest nor physician. He's much more like a nuclear engineer who periodically goes into the very heart of the reactor to reprogram the world.
Yes, beautifully said. And all the rituals you mentioned are in fact capturing the Avatar movie. Maybe people think that that's a science fiction movie, but
well, it's funny. Jim Cameron's a good friend of mine, and just before he went into production of what will be the next 3 or 4 avatars, he's shooting them all at once. He had me come down to speak to the entire senior staff and all the cast of the movie, just as he had taken them all to Hawaii to immerse them in a rainforest, because of course, much of Avatar is shot on with computer imagery. And he toured me through the set where they do it. And it's scientifically, it's fascinating, but the actors don't have a visceral experience of the world that we all see when we enjoy the films. And so Jim wanted me to speak about these issues, largely, I think, because he wanted me to share a mission, a message with the cast in particular, that Avatar, and this is what makes Jim Cameron so wonderful, Avatar is not a science fiction fantasy in many ways, given what we know is happening to forests around the world, to ocean reefs around the world, to indigenous people around the world. In a way, it's a documentary feature.
Yeah, indeed. Let's spend a little time on your latest book, Magdalena, River of Dreams. Some people call it a love letter to Colombia. Please expand on that.
Well, that was Hector Abad, who's a great friend of mine, and I thought it was a very beautiful thing he said. He also said, Colombia suffered so much, and Hector's father was one of the many killed, and his father's death was one of the was the inspiration for his brilliant book Oblivion, which is now a feature film, but also it was very difficult. It was one of the handfuls of killings in Colombia that shook the entire nation, because his father was apparently such a wonderful man. And it made Hector famously bitter about his country in a kind of public way. People knew it. And he obviously went into exile in Italy for a long time. But he also said of Magdalena that, only Wade could make me love my country again. And that was such a beautiful thing that he wrote. Look, I mean, Colombia made my life, and I've always felt a deep loyalty to a nation, and the nation has not deserved its agonies. 50 years of war, 260,000 dead, 7 million internally displaced, 5 million by volition or coercion circumstances, forced to flee the country, 100,000 missing. In a war that never involved more than 300,000 combatants on all three sides, the paramilitaries, the Paracos, or the ELN and the M19 and the FARC on the left, and of course the Colombian army. So in a country of 50 million people, there were never more than 300,000 combatants. Most Colombians were innocent victims of a war that would not have lasted a day if it wasn't for the international consumption of cocaine. Cocaine was the fuel, is the fuel that ignites and maintains the fires of Colombia's agonies. Think about it, Claudiu. In the last year before the peace agreement was negotiated in Havana and signed in Cartagena in 2016, the FARC, the main leftist group, were down to about 6,000 cadre, mostly teenagers in search of a meal. And yet, nevertheless, they made that year $600 million through extortion and drug trafficking. Well, if you give me the Boy Scouts of Manhattan and $600 million, I promise you I can wreak havoc in all of the eastern United States. And imagine how the United States would feel if Canada had patterns of drug consumption in bars and boardrooms across the country, laws that empowered a black mafia trade, and sanctions so lax that it did nothing to curb the distribution of the drug, such that 85 million Americans were forced to flee their homes or their country. Well, that's what happened to Colombia. And yet, incredibly, despite that, Colombia maintained civil society, democracy, greened its cities, created millions of acres of national parks, sought restitution with indigenous people in a way that no nation state has, and paved the way for a renaissance as two generations of young Colombians forced to flee the chaos and the violence of the conflict are returning from capital cities all around the world and skill sets in every conceivable endeavor. I mean, Colombia, when the peace agreement was signed, I said, the world's maybe falling apart, but Colombia's falling together. Obviously, any number of challenges occur today. The peace agreement hangs by a thread, and we can talk about the reasons for that if you want. But the most important thing is that the world, in a sense, owes Colombia something, in my opinion. And the main point, of course, as you well know, Colombia is not a land of violence and conflict and drugs. It's a place, as I write, of colores y cariño, where the people have been able to endure this horrific passage because of their character and their intense spirit of place, which is informed by their love of a land that is the most bountiful on the planet. There is no place in Colombia more than a day removed from every known ecological formation on Earth. It is the world's most in terms of diversity, ecological, geographical, and biological. There's no nation state that can match it. It is simply the most beautiful country in the world in terms of both its cultural and biological diversity and the sheer wonder of its people. I would say that only Colombians could have endured what that nation has been asked to endure. And so I wanted to tell that story. And what better way to tell it than through the metaphor of the river that made possible the nation? Because Colombia, Carlos Vives, the great Colombian musical icon, once told me that, cumbia, which is Colombia's great musical gift to the world, and incidentally, Colombia is described as a land of 1,000 rhythms. Ethnomusicologists have in fact identified 1,025. And cumbia, as Carlos told me, is the mother of all the other forms of music, porro, merengue, salsa, tambora, whatever. But the mother of cumbia is the Rio Magdalena. And of course, the Rio Magdalena is the story of Colombia. Colombia is the gift of the river. It's not just a corridor of commerce. It's like the Mississippi. It's a fountain of culture. It's a repository of Colombian music, poetry, literature, and prayer. It's the umbilical cord that made possible the settlement of the most tortured landscape, in the best sense of the word, in the world. And so what I did is I spent 5 years embracing the entire cuenca of the Magdalena, and I sort of practiced sociology as serendipity. I would go to a small town, a fishing village, and simply wait until I met someone who had something to say that the world needed to hear. And the book is made up of those characters. And because of my own, I was very lucky that I had written a book called One River, which was translated as El Rio in Colombia, and it came out in 2002 at a time when Colombia was essentially a failed state. And at a time with the psychological impact of the war, the whole idea of kids growing up as pariahs, a country that was an embarrassment, where they traveled with a passport and just by being Colombian could mean they'd get strip searched, as even the highest level of political officials would get strip searched. I mean, the psychological impact, my friend Sandra, for example, at the age of 15, when she could not, the height of Escobar's terror, when she could not distinguish the sound of thunder from the sound of bombs, her family sent her to live with a grandmother in Miami, where she was immediately made fun of for being from the land of Escobar by American high school students whose main social activity was the pursuit of drugs, with Colombian cocaine being their drug of choice. And of course, Sandra had never used, let alone seen cocaine growing up in Medellin, as most Colombians have not, right? And so the psychological impact it was really profound. And One River came out as El Rio, translated by a beautiful Colombian poet, the late Nicolas Sescuan. And the book in Spanish became, you'll laugh, but I think 150 pages longer. And so there was this massive book, and in 700 pages, there was nothing but love for the country. And it became not just a hit, it was kind of like a map of dreams for 2 generations of young people who couldn't travel within their own country because of the violence and the conflict. And yet this was an account in part of a time before the cocaine wars, where I had been free to travel anywhere my feet took me and sleep anywhere my hat fell. And at no point was I ever afraid, because the warmth of the Colombian people enveloped me like a protective shroud tailor-made for wonder.
Based on my own research and readings, I think the US is in entertaining or still maintaining the cocaine trade for their own benefit. And, there are some...
Oh, I mean, it's not even about benefit as much as they're 2 sides of the same coin. I mean, nobody in the US government wants to win the war on drugs. I mean, it's a line item in the federal budget that some years is $60 billion, and every piece of the government gets a piece of the action. If we legalize, the truth is that the war on drugs began because Richard Nixon wanted to create a wedge between his so-called silent majority. He was a master at manipulating hatred, and the people that were frightening that silent majority, the hippies, the drug users, the blacks in the 1960s. He could have cared less about people's use of drugs, as Ehrlichman, his domestic policy advisor, admitted in his memoirs. And yet the war on drugs has become the greatest folly in the history of public policy in the United States. After 50 years of spending upwards of $60 billion a year, a total of $1 trillion, there are more people in more places using worse drugs in worse ways than ever before since the beginning of that misguided campaign. And if in fact you legalize drugs tomorrow, you would find that use plummeted, because you'll never meet anybody whose decision to use or not use an illicit drug has anything to do with their legal status. And a big part of the engine that drives the illicit trade is the sheer amount of money being made from it, right? Take out that incentive and everything kind of dissipates like air out of a balloon. And, you know, and meanwhile, the irony is, of course, coca is not cocaine. It's like, coca is to cocaine what potatoes are to vodka. You know, coca is a divine leaf of immortality. And during all of these years, nobody, until we did it in the 1970s, had ever done a nutritional study of the plant, even as they were calling for its eradication. And it turns out the plant is full of vitamins, full of calcium, perfect for a diet that lacks a dairy product, enzymes that enhance the body's ability to digest carbohydrate at high elevation. It is the perfect stimulant for the modern age, benign, gentle, lucid, and if properly marketed as a nutraceutical, it would dwarf the scale of the coffee industry in Colombia. It would give campesinos a market for their coca, which they are going to grow because it has up to 1,000 times more return than any other cultigen. And why should Colombians, I might add, allow Americans to dictate the use of poisonous aerial defoliants that threaten Colombia's greatest natural asset, its biodiversity, not to mention the life of their children, in order to eliminate a drug that their own people, for whatever reasons, choose to use in cubicles and office corners across the country, in bars and boardrooms, a drug best used by your dentist to extract a tooth. And if they want to seek oblivion in an anesthetic, let them do it, but don't blame the Colombian people, and don't punish the Colombian people for a problem that you, because of the condition of your own society at home, can't seem to control. It's your people that want to consume this drug, and and it's consumption that drives the illicit trade. Eliminate the trade, eliminate the profit motive, and you'll find that drug use will plummet.
Yeah, and I think you're referring to the recently resumed program of Lysol spraying in Colombia, maybe.
Well, I mean, yeah, of course, this is all pressure from the American government.
Yes.
Who look, let me tell you a story, and we'll probably have to wind this up. I'll go on to it. But, you know, when I studied with Tim Plowman, I was a field assistant on his big coca project in the 1970s. And for a year and a half, Tim and I traveled together everywhere we could find coca. And at the time, the botanical origins weren't clear. The point of origin of the cultigen was not clear, even though it was a very important plant that yielded our most important topical anesthetic, cocaine hydrochloride, still essential in nose, throat, and ear surgery. Remember the adage, no such thing as good and bad drugs, good and bad ways of using drugs. Abstinence can be a good way of using drugs, but using cocaine as a topical anesthetic is a good way of using cocaine. But we knew nothing about its nutritional status of the plant either. And when we came up with all this research, I came back and Tim said to me, Willie, he used to call me Willie, there's a job at the US Department of Agriculture I want you to apply for, but if you take the job, I'll kill you. So I thought that was interesting. So I go out to the USDA at Beltsville, Maryland. First thing I notice as I go into the office of this guy is he's a drug addict. I can't get in the room for the cigarette smoke. The second thing I notice is that he's got all his walls are decorated with seized paraphernalia. It's like going into the office of an anti-pornographer and seeing pornography everywhere. And then I'm looking at this guy, it's the 1970s, he's got a big open butterfly collar, gold chains around his neck, gold bits and pieces on the wristwatch of his golden watch. And I'm thinking, Jesus, man, I've met this guy somewhere. And then I asked him, what's the job? And after all the research we had done, all they've concluded is that Tim and I are good at finding cocales, coca plantations. And he wants me to go back into the field, secure the pests that predate on coca, bring them back so they can be genetically modified and then reintroduced in South America. That's all they've learned from all of our research, including the revelation that the plant was incredibly important in the nutritional regime of the people. And so then I say, well, isn't that a little hazardous? And he reaches his claw into his chest and pulls out golden dog tags with all his agents who have been killed. You can't make this up. And then I'm thinking, where have I met this guy before? I know this guy. And of course, the answer was I didn't know him at all, but I had met him 1,000 times in Rio Negro, in Medellin, in the early days of the cartel. Carlos Leder, who flew all the coke into the Bahamas for Escobar, lived right up the road from us. In 1973, 74, the cocaine trade was still in the hands of the drifter, the California hippie. Cocaine was a sweet sister. No one thought it was bad. I mean, at our farm, people would bring briefcases full of cocaine and open them as long as they could play their guitars. I happily and luckily never liked cocaine. I thought it was an evil drug. Much as I love chewing coca, I always hated cocaine and I never used it. But the point is that this guy working for the DEA, pretending to work for the USDA, was the cartel. There were two halves of the same coin. The vibe was identical. And the point of this is that the cartel has no interest whatsoever in the legalization of cocaine. Their profits will plummet. But similarly, the DEA agents have no interest whatsoever in ending or winning the war on drugs. What are they going to do? Go back to Peoria, Illinois and work as soda fountain clerks? I don't know what, but they sure won't have the dashing life they have now with budgets out the wazoo and a sacred mission to destroy this plant, which has been used for 8,000 years in South America with no evidence of toxicity, let alone addiction, and known to the peoples of every pre-Columbian civilization, Moche, Chimu, Tehuanaco, Nazca, Paracas, Inca, Chachapoyas, all the way up into the Muisca and the Tairona, as the divine leaf of immortality. The gift of coca to the world would be Colombia's greatest legacy. But instead, we have this endless war, which will not go away. And it remains cocaine, which threatens the stability of Colombia today and undercuts the progress made through the peace agreement. Cocaine is a culprit, but the ultimate responsibility for all of the blood that has been spilt and has flowed in the rivers of Colombia in the last 50 years, ultimate responsibility lies with everyone you know who has ever used illicit cocaine and every government that has made possible by that trade by prohibiting the drug while doing nothing meaningful or serious to curtail the distribution of that evil drug.
Yeah, you're right. Wade, you are a wealth of knowledge and we can go on for hours and I have to be conscious of your time. Any final thoughts?
No, I just wanted to thank you and just ask if you'd be kind enough to send me a link to the presentation when you put it up.
For sure, it will go up in 2 or 3 weeks. And to my viewers, please share it, like it, make your comments. They are always welcome to do that. Support me on patreon.com/Claudiu Murgan. And until next time, love and gratitude.